Welcome, everyone, to this year's convening, Truth and Transformation 2023, Tools for Accountability, Lessons and Strategies for Racial Equity. This is our 5th year hosting the conference. I'm extremely excited about this year's timely and important panels, keynotes, and we have an amazing art intervention. A few quick and important housekeeping items. If you need technical help, please email ira@hks.harvard.edu. There is a different Zoom webinar link for each session today. You can find these in the email that you received or by looking at the chat at the end of each session. Questions for the panelists can be submitted at any time through the Q&A tab. We will be culling those to provide the moderators doing the Q&A portion of each panel. Please share your takeaways via Twitter and LinkedIn using hashtag Truth and Transformation. And don't forget to tag Ira. All keynotes and panels will be recorded, closed captioned, and sent to registrants. After the second panel today, we will have artist Jessica Valores working live on Zoom to create a piece based on what she's heard today. Please join us for this interactive art intervention. It should be quite exciting. You can learn more about all of today's amazing speakers on our website. And today's convening was free and open to the public, and we hope to keep it that way. If you would like to donate to the IRA project, you can do so by following the Donate Now button that's going to appear magically in the chat. Or head over to IRA's website, www.ira.hks.harvard.edu, and look for the donate button in the header. I'd like to start our day by acknowledging the physical space upon which we hold programs and do our work, and where many of us live. This is the unceded land of the Massachusetts people. This land was stolen. As the Massachusetts tribe of Ponkapog indicates, the tribe are the descendants of the original people of the English invaders first encountered in what is now the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They have survived as the descendants of the first people of Massachusetts because they've retained the oral tradition of storytelling, just as their ancestors did. This tradition passes on the Massachusetts view of how the world works, its relationship with all of nature, and why things are the way they are. And the land we are on has long served as a gathering of nations. At IRA, we seek to amplify the voices of Indigenous people across the US and globally, including as speakers at today's conference. Special thanks to the Harvard Project on Indigenous Governance and Development for connecting us with incredible Indigenous voices. We affirm the words of the Native Governance Center. Land acknowledgement is only one small part of supporting Indigenous communities. We hope our land acknowledgement statement will inspire others to stand with us in solidarity with Native nations. Also, if you are local, please join us at the Harvard Powwow this Saturday at the Harvard University McGurty Stadium. The grand entrance begins at 1 p.m. Now I want to turn things over to Professor Arkan Fong, the director of the Ash Center and the Winthrop Laughlin McCormick Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government, for a few words of introduction.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Truth and Transformation Conference. The Ash Center is the hub of the Kennedy School and Harvard for work that develops ideas and practices to create a more equal and inclusive, multiracial and multi-ethnic democracy all around the world. The Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project is a jewel of the Ash Center, and this annual Truth and Transformation Conference that you all have joined is one of our most important efforts of the year. Directing the IRA project is, of course, my treasured colleague, Khalil Gibran Muhammad. Professor Muhammad is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is a division of the New York Public Library and the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. Without further ado, let me turn things over now to Khalil.
Thank you very much, Arkan. And indeed, welcome to the Truth and Transformation Conference of 2023. I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning. As is often said, you could have chosen to be elsewhere this morning, but you chose to be here. Today's half-day conference is day 1 of 2, the second of which will be next Wednesday, October 3rd. Please be sure to join us then. This is our 5th annual Truth and Transformation Conference. I want to thank our incredible team, Allison, Erica, Angel, Gloria, Carrie, Carla, Jahida, Miriam, and of course, the many wonderful people here at the Ash Center, Melissa, Sarah, Gina, Daniel, and our executive director, Tim, for all that you've done to support us. I also want to thank the Open Society Foundation for continuing to support this annual event. And yes, I should emphasize, this conference is as important as it was when it began in 2019, before the backlash to the 1619 Project, before the killing of George Floyd, before the national reckoning, and before the legislative assault on the freedom to learn, teach, read, and speak the truth of American history. We started in 2019 with a simple proposition that the work of racial equity is not out there, somebody else's problem, some politician's issue to solve, or some other organization, but that the problem is at home, within the walls of our and often your own organization. So we focused on the Harvard Kennedy School and its poor record of progress over many decades. We brought back alumni to tell the stories of their attempts 40 years ago to diversify and make more equitable this school. And we showcased leaders in other institutions that had done effective truth-telling and transformation at their institutions, including the former president of Brown and Smith Universities, Ruth Simmons. You can watch this and all our past conferences at our website or read highlights of the proceedings. The next year, in 2020, we considered the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the private sector and heard from leading practitioners who highlighted successes, challenges, and failures, largely in the unwillingness to create performance measures to track change. Overwhelmingly, our experts noted that without data and accountability, change was not possible. Our third conference reflected on a year of promises, taking stock of how well corporations and nonprofits were in keeping to their racial equity commitments. Millions, or I should say, their multi-billion-dollar investments, or the dismantling of systemic racism that they promised after millions of people took to the streets demanding racial justice. Change, of course, is mostly slow and incremental, but we learned from many people on corporate and nonprofit boards and others at the leadership table how performative many of these commitments were. Last year, we turned our attention to the value of truth-telling, both here in the United States and internationally, recognizing that too many organizations skipped over reckoning with their own exclusionary practices in the past to simply focus on the future. But this is like hastily treating someone who complains of back pain with ibuprofen when what they really need is a CT scan to discover that they have kidney stones or something much worse. We learned that there is no pathway to healing, to transformation, to justice that does not begin with a proper diagnosis of the problem and an unflinching commitment to truth. Today, we focus on tools for accountability, lessons, and strategies for racial equity. What can we learn from people at all levels, from the C-suite to the community, who have successfully pushed for accountability from within the institutions where they work? We will start with our opening panel on roadmaps and what is required for charting the course for effective racial equity work. Following, we will convene a discussion of the impact of reporting and regulating for change. This will culminate with a keynote by Christine Cordero of Asian Pacific Environmental Network, who will draw out the critical strategies her work has imbued to organize at the crux of racial and environmental justice, particularly with AAPI communities and immigrants. Today's conference also comes at the most urgent time in most of our lives. No matter what side of the equality versus equity divide or censorship versus truth-telling line you stand on, the future of this society and much of the world is at stake with the choices legislative, political, judicial, and private sector leaders are making right now. It is not an exaggeration to say that it is increasingly the case that many of you, if you work in the DEI space especially, may lose your job in the not too distant future. Your shop might be criminalized by law or dismantled by corporate policy. Let me remind you that from 2021 to 22, in every state except Delaware, government officials introduced at least one anti-woke or critical race theory measure, including bills, resolutions, executive directives, legislation, regulations, and statements. And in June 2023, the Supreme Court struck down the strongest piece of federal policy linked to better equity in higher education, race-based affirmative action. Even before the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the falsely named plaintiff, Students for Fair Admissions, corporate DEI programs were facing increased scrutiny. Florida and Texas have already banned DEI work in the public sector, as did the Trump administration in all federal agencies a few years ago. The organization Students for Fair Admissions, among others, have now squarely set their sights on DEI as the next litigation target, with a public warning stating, quote, all DEI programs and all balancing in employment, training, scholarships, and promotions based on race, national origin, or sex are illegal, and by establishing a TIPS hotline. We know and should know that the 14th Amendment was established to address 250 years of chattel slavery, with a guarantee that race-based discrimination would be visible and evident in anti-discrimination work. Here we are in a topsy-turvy reality. This fight is real, and we are in it, here to provide knowledge, research, and resources to people on the front lines, like so many of you. Almost 40 suits on the other side of the ledger, some of the good news we shared today, have been filed against companies, including Delta Airlines and Wells Fargo, in the last 3 years because of allegedly misleading promises and statements of diversity and equity commitments, according to an analysis by Bloomberg Law. A common theme that these suits allege is that companies have failed to live up to their aspirations and have failed to implement goals that they allegedly claim fall outside the company's missions on the basis of return to value to shareholders. You are increasingly hearing critiques of so-called woke capitalism that not only will set back what minimal progress we have seen since the end of the civil rights era, but surely will contribute to global climate change and the inevitable destruction of this planet. Just 2 days ago, a federal judge in Atlanta denied a conservative group's request for an injunction to stop a Black woman-owned venture capitalist firm from awards grants exclusively to Black women entrepreneurs. So I say again, people are fighting this battle. So today and next week, we have the opportunity yet again to choose to learn the tools we need to achieve accountability, to choose truth and transformation. We can choose to lead and to join those doing this work well. And now, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce my colleague, Angel Rodriguez, who will be moderating our first panel. Angel is a dedicated research associate at the IRA Project, where he leads the health and STEM focus areas. He and I recently published a pioneering study on anti-racist institutional change in healthcare. This project, conducted with support from the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation, sheds light on effective paths for institutional change that close racial disparities in healthcare. We invite you to download the report at our website that can be found at ira.hks. It is my honor to turn things over to Angel, who will moderate our first panel. Angel, take it away.
Hello, good morning. Thank you, Khalil, for that great introduction. I want to say welcome everyone, if this is your first TNT or if this is your fifth one. We're excited to have you join us today. As the racial equity field expands, there is a range of resources to inform the process of anti-racist change. In this session, we'll focus on a common starting point, roadmaps. This panel will feature advocates with years of experience establishing systems for accountability in their own organizations and fields. From launching new initiatives to shifting internal operations, they'll exchange ideas and tactics for building accountability by answering a common theme question. What strategies generate the strongest impact for organizational anti-racist change? To guide us on this theme today, please allow me to introduce our distinguished panelists First and foremost, Dr. Aletha Maybank, a physician, is Senior Vice President and Chief Health Equity Officer at the American Medical Association. Secondly is Chitra Kumar, the Managing Director of Climate and Energy at the Union for Concerned Scientists, with notable experience at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. Lastly, and of course, Lorenzo, Herrera, and Lozano, the co-executive director of Justice Funders, guiding the transformation of philanthropy towards a justice transition. So without further ado, let's jump into it with some helpful definitions for our audience today. Hello, everyone. Hello. Okay, to get us going, this question is for the group to get us oriented around what accountability means in the context of racial equity in your organization. And if you can share with us a brief understanding of how that accountability is deployed from your position. Thank you. Oh, okay. I think we're on mute here. Our panelists, give them 1 second to unmute here. Let me repeat the question for us to get us going. Again, helpful definitions here. What does accountability mean within the context of racial equity in your organization? Perhaps we can start with Dr. Maybank.
Good morning. Just wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be in conversation. I'm excited to learn from my co-panelists as well, and just grateful for the work that Ira has been doing in really highlighting that accountability is critical to do this work of racial justice. You know, I'm a Chief Health Equity Officer, as was mentioned, at the American Medical Association, which has been around now 176 years. It's a physician advocacy organization, and you know, its mission is around you know, the betterment of public health, as well as making sure that they are the physicians, as they say, most powerful ally. And it, you know, it has a very strong healthcare lobby, but a very well-known history for the most part of, while advocating for healthcare and different aspects of healthcare, but also has a history of racial injustice. One, just in terms of its lack of advocacy, as an example, during the civil rights era for civil rights and desegregation, even of hospitals, and you know, trying to block Medicare and Medicaid and Medicare, especially, in passing that, but also in excluding Black physicians for over 100 years of its history. And so there are a lot of policies that they have also supported that also, you know, perpetuated or put forth racial injustice in structural ways within this country, or had structural impacts. And so, you know, my role specifically now, 4.5 years in this role, the House of Delegates, so AMA has a representation of all states. So it kind of operates in one level, very democratically per se, and it's very much structured kind of like how Congress has representation. Representation has a certain amount of kind of, you know, votes and power and all of that within the organization. They put forward policies that they will advocate for. And then I'm hired and I'm on the team and the management team, because there are over 200,000 and 250,000 members. There's a management team that kind of operationalizes or executes on the policy that's passed by the House of Delegates within the AMA. A lot of folks don't quite get that, and I try to go through that because accountability is at several levels. And so one of the ways of which this institution holds itself accountable are through the policies that the House of Delegates passes. And so 4.5 years ago, there was a policy that was put forward to create an organizational unit called the Center for Health Equity, and to have this position hired. in order for AMA to have a more intentional focus on equity work, and that it's not just a decision by one person, but it actually is rooted in the structure and policy of AMA to have this position, and then to bring somebody on board to do this. And I am held accountable to ensure that we had a strategic plan in place. So in terms of a roadmap for racial justice at the AMA, and I'm held accountable by our board of trustees. And so I have, we have to share annual progress and updates based on the strategic plan that was developed it was 2021, at which was released. So the time period is 2021 to 2023 of the strategic plan to embed racial justice and advance health equity. It's a document that 80 pages long, a little too long for any strategic plan. I don't think any plan should be that long, but noting that in healthcare, there were just so many different understandings and not, I don't feel like good, strong understanding of even what the problem was. I think Khalil mentioned it about you have to know the problem and be able to diagnose the problem in order to know where to go. And so we really needed to lay out, what is the basics of what is racism, and what does that mean within medicine, distinctions between the social drivers of health and structural drivers of health. And you have to, in terms of intersectionality and all of that. So you had to kind of define all those pieces within the document. But then the document itself, lays out 5 approaches of how we were going to do our work. One of them in the last approach is fostering pathways for truth and reconciliation and healing at AMA in light of our past. And so we've been embarking on doing lots of work around that. We have accountability through external, advisors, as well as goals and metrics, and that we have not just as myself as the Center for Health Equity, but really across the entirety of our enterprise. So whether you're communications or your IT, HR is pretty well understood in terms of workforce equity, but all these other functions, if you're overseeing data, you're overseeing medical education, you have to, there was accountability, and all of our business units had to create equity action plans. So you have the larger, strategic plan, and then everyone had to create their own equity action plans with metrics, goals, and all of that, and are held accountable, through and via our CEO. And that's kind of, the structure that we're using right now, I would say, just in brief. And I think, there's accountability even, for me and towards me, or, from my own team, because I don't think you can have accountability without supporting and building a culture that allows for greater transparency, but also greater psychological safety within the culture, in order to have the kind of really truth telling that accountability, requires. And so building that part of the work, to me, has been the harder part of the work, truthfully. And what does it mean to drive culture that allows for accountability, is what I'm always constantly considering.
Thank you, Dr. Maybank, for situating us and understanding how accountability works within the healthcare and your organization. I'd love to hear from Chitra, similarly, but of course from a different sector and organization, on what does accountability mean within the context of racial equity in your organization.
Thank you, Angel, and I want to also thank Dr. Muhammad and the entire IRA team for the opportunity to be here with this distinguished panel, and of course, the other panelists. It's really an honor. So to understand what accountability means in the environmental sector, we have to recognize that there's a growing body of research that shows that pollution is not distributed equally, that Black and Brown people tend to be exposed much more to more than one toxin at a time, and much more to them. The exposure gets worse the more racially segregated a community is, and that exposure to multiple toxins can have a worse health impact than that of an individual toxin, and the additional burden of other stressors such as disparities in education and healthcare can compound the impact of toxic exposure. So activists knew this. People who were studying this, along with the civil rights movement, knew this decades ago and convinced the administration at the time to set up a environmental equity office. This was all the way back in 1992, when was set up at EPA to start to delve into this problem. And then in 1994, President Bill Clinton signed the executive order on environmental justice. And at that time, they decided to use the term justice instead of equity. And then the Office of Environmental Justice was formed. So this was more than 30 years ago. And EPA has had that much time to sort of wrestle with these questions of what does it mean to be accountable? Well, it is, and I've been there, I was at EPA for 20 years. I joined the Union of Concerned Scientists just back in May. And I'll sort of balance some of my comments. I'll focus my comments on the equity work and the equity action plans that we were asked to put together back at EPA by the Biden-Harris administration. But I will also mention that UCS has gone through its own journey, and maybe we just won't necessarily have time to go through all of that today, but that it's, I would do a disservice to UCS by not saying and acknowledging that part of my reason for making the shift is sort of an acknowledgement that this organization too is investing heavily on anti-racism work and has set up a JEDI office, a Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion office. So going back to the EPA's work, you have to understand what environmental justice means. So as EPA defines it, it's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. And that is the procedural part of the definition. And then it's talking about it in terms of development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And the goal will only be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, as well as equal access to the decision-making processes. So they're both distributive and procedural justice are attended to in this definition. And when the Biden-Harris administration came in, they signed in Executive Order 13985, and that actually required all the agencies to put together an equity action plan. What it did back then was require senior leaders to put together teams and actually define what do we mean within the sphere of EPA's mandate, how would we implement this? And they put together the major categories of what EPA does and how they saw equity being able to be advanced. So this would have to, they mentioned things like a comprehensive framework for considering cumulative impacts in EPA decisions, building the capacity of underserved communities to even be able to intervene or provide input into EPA's work, developing in EPA's internal capacity to engage underserved communities and implement clear and accountable processes to act based on the input of communities, and then strengthen our civil rights compliance program, which we knew was woefully under-resourced until that time, as well as acknowledging that there's a role for communities to be involved in science. And so integrating participatory community science into EPA's research program was another goal, as well as acknowledging about EPA's procurement and contracting processes, making those equitable. So lots of dimensions that we were trying to work on. And the other thing that it referenced is EPA had a long-term planning process underway where justice and equity had never been articulated explicitly. And for the first time with this administration and Administrator Regan's mandate to the agency, we were required to look at building out measures in the long-term plan, which was going to last for beyond just this administration, to try to embed that work with all of the career staff within EPA. And I won't go into the details of it, but just share that there was a lot of paper that was involved and planning involved in making sure people understood what we meant by accountability, and a lot of invention happening, because this was the first time we were invited to the table to do a lot of this work.
Excellent, excellent. There's definitely plenty to unpack there, those dimensions that you mentioned, Chitra. Now let's turn it over to Lorenzo to give us a understanding from the philanthropic side, what accountability means in the context of racial equity at your organization.
Thank you. Buenos dias. Good morning. Again, my name is Lorenzo Herrera y Lozano, and very grateful to be here with you all, and it's really an honor to be on this panel with you all as well. I am zooming in from unceded Ohlone territory, also known as the Mission District in San Francisco. And I work at Justice Funders, and I apologize, I am getting over a cold or something, which I knew the cough would start the minute it was my turn to speak. So I will do my best to hold it in. So Justice Funders, we are a partner and guide for philanthropy to redistribute wealth, democratize power, and shift economic control to communities. And so we work, our work is based on the framework of just transition. And so we're looking at how to support foundations or philanthropy to move away from continuing to invest in the very systems that perpetuate human harm and human suffering, right? And recognizing that foundations are in fact a byproduct or product of the very systems of economic exploitation that have been extracting resources from communities for the last few hundred years. And so our vision is that we envision a world that honors the sacredness of our natural resources and recognizes the inalienable rights of all. And our vision is, we call it a 100-year vision. And when I think about accountability, I think about the generations who will be on the receiving end of that vision, and hopefully will be on the receiving end of the work that we are doing. And so for me, accountability is, what do I need to do to be able to show up every day and as my full and best self? And what are the conditions I need to do that, because I am accountable again to them? So what kind of ancestor will I be? And recognizing that 100 years is not a long time when it comes to human evolution. So the internal resources that they will have will not be that much different than the ones we have today. And so rather than constantly postponing the embodiment of our vision, how do we start doing that today? How do we start envisioning today? So how do we push ourselves in that way? And so that's where the accountability is at. How do we raise the bar for one another? And so how we've been doing that at Justice Funders. So the roadmap, there's a framework that we've been developing called regenerative leadership. And so it's based on the premise that the more we impact the systems that we seek to change, the more we should expect resistance, right? The work should get harder, the more we succeed at really interrupting the capitalist exploitation of communities. And so we're going to need to be more resilient. We're going to need to be, have the courage to continue pushing forward as the work gets harder. We also know that our vision, and so here we call it from the world of botanists and the heliotropic effect, that as fields of wildflowers turn to the sun throughout the day, that as living organisms, we too turn to life-giving forces. So our vision, this 100-year vision, being the life-giving force, that the sun that is pulling us forward, and so that we are building in the direction of what we want rather than away from what we don't want. And that vision, though, to sustain us for 100 years, needs to be constantly deepening, becoming ever richer. And to do that, we need to be living at the edges of our imagination. So how do we then create the conditions for all of this, right? How do we constantly be doing this? And so we start by acknowledging that we aren't machines, right? That we are not, to paraphrase Brené Brown, that we're not cognitive beings who on occasion feel. We are feeling beings who on occasion think, right? And so how do we really honor our shared humanity by recognizing that there are days when I show up without breakfast, or when I wake up at 4 a.m, and my brain may not be where it might usually be. And there's some days are just hard. Some days I show up heartbroken. Some days I show up hungry. So all kinds of things are happening. So every single day a different me shows up. And how can we show up for one another as we show up as fully human? And so there are two models that we can point towards of what is possible when we meet basic psychological needs in our organizations and how we create the kind of cultures that can support that. And so one is intrinsic motivation, which comes from fields of self-determination theory. And so how can we meet basic psychological needs? So in this case, being autonomy, which is different from independence, right? I'm still connected to others, but I have some level of agency in how I do my work. Competence, that I know enough about what I'm doing to feel confident in it. Mastery, that I'm feeding that psychological need of learning, of constantly of curiosity. And relatedness, that the humans with whom I get to do this work matter to me, and there's evidence that I matter to them. And purpose, that I am doing what I want to be doing on the planet right now, is aligning with what I'm doing at work. And so research has suggested for the last several decades that when these psychological needs are met, you can't stop me, right? So you from showing up. And so whereas with external motivation, which is really the foundation for management and even supervision, and the strategies that come out of the Industrial Revolution, which were less about how do we get people who are bringing their best thinking, how do we just maximize output, labor output from workers, right? And which is also the foundation of public education, right? How do we just get workers who can comply? And the problem with that is that you have to threaten or incentivize. And so we've inherited this coercive system where, based on fear and threats and dangling carrots, we want to control people's behavior. But with intrinsic motivation, if the work itself becomes a reward, there's no stopping us. And that's the kind of brains we need. That's the kind of imagination we need to actually change the world. And it so happens that those psychological needs are very similar to the ones that we would need to be able to experience what Martin Seligman from positive psychology calls the perma well-being model for flourishing. So positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. So we could actually be creating the condition together in our organizations where we are basically coming alive in our work, where the work is becoming the reward, where the work itself becomes irresistible, and that it's not in spite of one another, but because of one another. But that takes work, right? So how do we do that? And to create the conditions for these, to be able to meet the psychological needs, we spent a lot of time developing our organizational values, which we then operationalize. And so our values being psychological safety. So in summary, can I trust that you will not shame me, that you will not question my ability to learn, and that you will not question my belonging here? Centering well-being. So obviously that I need to take care of myself, but that I take care of myself, one, because it is just, but also because the work is hard. So I need the rest to be able to show up with you the next day. And so in then radical interdependence, right, that I'm not in this alone, and I need you. We need one another to do this, and there's this symbiotic relationship between us. Generative leadership. So everything that I do is in service of moving us forward. So when there's tension between us, when there is, when something didn't feel good, to name it immediately, to tend to whatever the rupture or strain, because we're looking 100 years from now. So we can't afford to wait to have our feelings hurt right now. So we need to, there's space for the feelings, of course, but then we need to address them and tend to, because the train is moving. And the final one is untethered imagination. How do we live at the edges of our imagination? How are we constantly pushing ourselves, and recognizing that as powerful as the vision that we have for 100 years from now, that reality will be that much greater because it is currently limited by the boundaries of our imagination today. And so within this model, accountability then becomes the byproduct, but not the goal. Because of course I show up, not because I'm afraid of not failing you or not being accountable. I show up because showing up to work with you makes me come alive, because this is what is feeding me right now. And so It's less about what are the measures when I do fail or when I don't come through. It's more about what might be getting in the way when I don't come through and how do we address that. But that it's really about this thing that we are co-creating together, that we're constantly moving forward.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you for that, Lorenzo. And to the three of you, I appreciate how expansive of a definition that you operate for accountability in your organizations. I think it's very exciting to hear how, and as you, the three of you, enter into the organization and establish more systems of accountability, to take Lorenzo's word, like it gets harder. So I would love to explore some of that resistance that perhaps you have experienced and introducing initial initiatives or any initial challenges faced at your organization for introducing more systems of accountability. Chitra, would you mind starting on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned I'd spent 20 years at EPA, and people far before me had been really struggling to get parts of the organization, it's both people and systems, to understand the need for interrogating the work in a different way that addressed justice and equity. And, there has been a lot of historic resistance to it, especially if you think about the history of the Environmental Protection Agency and the whole movement. The environmental movement has had a history, whether you're thinking about John Muir or other founders of conservation, of environmental protection, the story, the American story of what it is to be environmental. It was all about places. It was about bunnies and birds, and sort of a lot of people who had gone through training from a scientific disciplines to then needing to shift to, well, what about the people? And there are also disciplines, many parts of EPA that also deal with public health and the people aspect related to, again, the industries aligned to, whether it's a smokestack or a water pipe. And so then to move from that to, well, what about procedures that actually enable the people who are affected by those forms of pollution to have more voice in what the outcomes are or the solutions are. So I'll just give you an example of where early in my career, I was working on power plant issues, and the dominant form of addressing that pollution was through trading pollution credits. The idea that, that's faster, it's more efficient. If a power plant can say, I want to continue to pollute over here where it's expensive, and then take a brand new power plant, put a brand new smokestack over here that it has the right scrubbers and everything that will get the pollution down, because we know air pollution travels over borders, and overall the well-being of everyone will be better. But that really overlooked the fact that certain populations who live next door to the power plant that continued to operate were being really disproportionately impacted. So that's just an example of the kinds of things we were trying to now tackle from a system that was set up to deal with everyone, not necessarily tailored for addressing disproportionate impact. So with that in mind, and I said, earlier, we were invited to the table to do this planning for long-term strategic goals. And for the first time, we had the opportunity to put measures into the strategic plan, which is, what we do is what we measure, right? With people motivated by that. And in our system, many of the other parts of the agency had already developed very specific metrics. And I'll just give you an example. One is from the Superfund program. They had a very specific measurable target. They were saying we were going to complete 225 Superfund cleanup projects that address lead as a contaminant. Now, that's not easy either, but it's very specific. Just to juxtapose that with what having never really worked through the strategic planning process at EPA before, we're trying to just had so much like excitement about the fact that we were getting political buy-in and high level support to be able to get at all the problems. And while we had that, we wanted to go for it. Well, we came up with while some of the offices had like maybe 6 total goals and objectives that they were going to try to work towards, we came up with 22. And many of them were not specific enough. So if I had a major, the challenge too was who does the work. We had a very small office. We had, when I started in that office a few years ago, at the beginning of the administration, we had about 26 people. And we recognized with increases in our budget, we were going to become an office that was more than 100. And the whole program was going to have more people all over the country to help implement this work. Also, the mandate for the entire agency to do its work differently was being shared with every part of the office. So we were hearing that message. People were more willing than they had ever been previously to work with us, but still everyone has the way that they've always done things. And then the resistance of how do we do this when we don't even know, for example, how to define some of the terms. So we had 22 measures. I'll give you an example of one of them that was quite broad. All EPA programs that seek feedback and comment from the public will provide capacity building resources to communities with environmental justice concerns to support their ability to meaningfully engage and provide useful feedback to those programs. So then we had, so that's lots of good stuff in there. We had to then go and say like, well, which EPA programs do we mean? Do we mean all programs, or do we mean the ones that actually work with communities? Because if it's a program about a technology that you only want to work with industry, then, how do we work with communities? All right, capacity building resources. Which ones are capacity building resources? And then what do we mean by meaningfully engage? Is it the usual check the box? No, that's not what we mean. We want it to be deeper, but there's a qualitative aspect to that. So we had to really dive in and spend, I think it's still ongoing. Even when I left after a year of doing this work, people are still trying to figure some of that out. So I think that was a powerful lesson for us and a challenge around, how do we do this work that is going to be transformational for the agency, knowing we had this window of opportunity with the kind of political support we had right now, and an awareness that, we came out of a different administration before where the pendulum had swung so far in the other direction, and now we're swinging even further back. So just a lot of internal, like, how do you actually staff up? How do you do it? Who do you bring in to help with these, answering these questions? So I'll kind of leave it there and let my other panelists.
No, and you're definitely describing a very public government office where appeal to the public is as important as the initiatives and policies that are delivered. I want to switch gears here a little bit more as we're getting through our interesting conversation, and return to Dr. Maybank as you situated us within the history of your organization, particularly a history around racist forms of exclusion and discrimination for Black physicians and other physicians of color. And I'm wondering, and as you explained to us, your role there was very unprecedented. Some of the initiatives you've been bringing to AMA and the larger medical profession have not been part of this organized association before. And I'm very excited to hear from you how you, in your time there, have been tracking and measuring your progress of change at AMA, and perhaps some indicators that would help us understand from outside of the profession what challenges or opportunities you may have been seeing.
Thanks for the question. I can answer it in a short period of time. Um, so I'll start with kind of the challenges and opportunities. This is the third time that I've started a Center for Health Equity over my career, right? Or some Office of Minority Health or whatever. So always within the context of an institution, starting some a literal kind of function and structure, but also trying to inspire and spark transformational change work or transformational work at the organizational level in order to advance equity. And to the point of how do the markers and the influencers and strategies of what determines progress over time, really I've been reflecting on a lot, because every institution I've been in, it's been different, except for the context of these, they're very long-standing kind of older institutions. I was at a health department, the New York City Health Department before, and doing this work. So another institution that is very deeply embedded into its ways of being and culture and practice that we're not always aligned with advancing equity. And most of our institutions in this country clearly are not, but especially in the space of health, I think in healthcare, it's one of those areas that we see the disparities and inequities tremendously on every level. And so for me, I've had to rely a lot on leadership at the highest level. So I've always reported, always been connected to, whether it's commissioner, CEO, or commissioner, CEO is really not, president, whatever the title is. And in order to kind of overcome and to work through challenges and opportunities, is really the relationship that I've had with that particular leader. So prior to that, most people know I was in the New York City Department of Health with Dr. Bassett. The relationship that I had with her was very critical in terms of my ability to be able to speak truth to what I saw, happening within the institution, and holding myself accountable to that, because I think that can be really challenging and hard for people if you're not used to doing that one, and you don't feel like you have the safety to do it. Really, the bottom line of it. And so, a part of the creating the momentum to address opportunities and challenges is creating that space and that relationship, so that you or myself, as the person who's leading and driving this work, has the safety to speak, right? And the relationship. And so it's the same thing at AMA. The relationship that I have with the CEO is really critical, but there have been differences. And so, and I'm pretty vocal about, Dr. Bassett definitely understood justice and had a strong foundation to that. So could lead and hold other folks accountable when there was, resistance, when challenges came up, in a way that I didn't have to per se. I focused on more so kind of what was the framework that we're going to use? How are we going to implement it? What's the infrastructure? What's the staff? Who's the staff? What's the investment? How much money and what am I going to ask for? So it's the same thing at AMA, all those conditions and realities. However, it's a different type of leadership. And I really came into a space of which I literally was the only one who had the expertise and the kind of the experience and knowledge of talking about justice and racial justice, any kind of justice and equity and all of that. And so there's a lot of kind of managing up, I guess, as we say it, or in a way that I hadn't had to do before. However, through that kind of opportunity and accountability as it relates to truth telling with the leader, been able to kind of create conditions where he's able to hold other people accountable, especially during those times of resistance. And, resistance, I think when you talk about metrics and measuring, can show up in exactly that. Folks may not want to put forward measures or put forward clear kind of processes, that you have that kind of just outright resistance or act confused, or I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. And so, the team that I have has had to be really helpful in creating and working with, the teams across the AMA to help support their capacity, their knowledge, and their ability to actually develop indicators and metrics that we can measure progress over time. And so, there's a lot of almost kind of convincing and pitching, the importance of this work. And you have to become very skilled in doing that, because there's the human element to it, right? It's not, all this work of justice is not, I can talk about the technical pieces, and I've talked more about the technical pieces of the work, but the ability of what Lorenzo was saying earlier, of people to share and understand and see a shared experience with others that they're working with, is really critical. And to understand that there's a shared humanity that we have, in this space, and creating that is actually, I think, from when I took a look at kind of top indicators and progress, I look at that and how more likely are people willing to kind of share their experience, share their story, share whatever it is, whatever their story is, with one another, to create spaces within the AMA, especially for the management team, of which they feel comfortable, again, to have a culture where they can talk, they can develop, they can plan, they can resist, collectively. All of those opportunities to me represent that there is progress in the AMA. When I first started, there were no ERGs, as they call employee resource groups, for any identity. Now we have them for every identity, and like caregiver group and caregiver equity, and every other racial and ethnic identity, for sure, but even beyond that. So to me, that represents that there's a different level of, again, there's a signal to say that, and that's the indicator, but there's a signal to say that it's okay for you all to come together within an institution. I would have taken that for granted, that people automatically did that and felt the space was safe to do so. But when I came into AMA and recognized it wasn't, those are kind of the easier, tangible opportunities and indicators to see, change over time. I think, though, for the larger, so that's like within the management team. And just the other point that I'll mention in terms of just numbers and data, my experience is that numbers and data to me are not sufficient enough to actually motivate people and to create sustainable change over time. I really, again, think it's about the heart piece, and the ability that I've seen from like leadership has always been, again, at this connection and opportunity for them to be in experiences with others, of which they're sharing their humanity and hearing their stories of others. That's where I've seen the most transformational movement within the AMA. It wasn't a reflection of looking at the numbers and the data and the disparities, but it was this willingness that came out of understanding and feeling some level of whatever it was towards and with other people that drove change. And so I those are the indicators that I kind of go for now at this point. They're harder to measure. I think Lorenzo has a good framework, actually, in listening to the words that Lorenzo has mentioned, but those are harder to measure. And then just at the larger scale, I think AMA, we're again physicians, across the board, and that we're representing across the country, from every single state. And when the equity plan first came forward, there was a lot of resistance, not only within AMA, but also outside of AMA and the physician community at large. And so we're measuring kind of how to measure that resistance, has been an opportunity for us to consider, and we're kind of figuring that out over time as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Okay, we're about to jump into Q&A from the audience. People have been flooding us with some good questions for our panel today. But just before, I wanted to ask one more quick question, and I wanted to direct this to Lorenzo. Lorenzo, if you would just share with us what makes the leadership of your organization a bit unique and different from other organizations. And the reason I'm asking that is because we're very interested in how one distinguishes between performative gestures and genuine efforts towards racial equity, especially as Dr. Maybank has said, there's sometimes the resistance shows up in acting confused or the leadership area is so core. So I'm wondering if you can answer this in a quick 1 to 2 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. So how I think about it is since I was a young person and moving into spaces where like, oh, people like me we've not, maybe we not that many of us here, or at the time we've never been here before. All right, I'm in the room. What wall do I knock down first? Right? Well, how can I leverage the power? How can I leverage the space, the opportunity of being in the room? And for my fellow co-executive director and I, Tina Kalokachen, something that's been super important to us as people who were like thrusted into executive leadership in our mid-20s, and then had struggled with these the conflicts and contradictions of being in these positions and aligning them with our values. When we established Justice Funders, which was previously a fiscally sponsored project for several years, and then became its own independent organization. It was important to us that, or an indicator for us that we're on the right path is our goal is that we get to a place where we have shared whatever knowledge we have, whatever skills we have, and that we are in constant dialogue with staff, and that we get to a point where a day might come where neither of us are in the room and the staff can move on, like decisions can be made, where we're not indispensable. Where hopefully we'll be missed, but we're not indispensable. Everything doesn't come to a halt. And I think so that's a key. And then also the politics. So I think for myself, my racial justice analysis starts with the Kumar River Collective Statement of 1977, and that if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since the freedom of Black women would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. And so that's like my point of departure. And so then how then can I leverage wherever I have access or opportunity to like leverage power. And so where we do it, just a couple of quick examples at Justice Funders is we took, because we're a multiracial organization, primarily people of color. I think we're about 70, 80% people of color. And this is my first time since I was, for the first 2 decades of my journey, I had only worked at organizations with staff and boards who were all people of color. So it was my first time working with white coworkers. So that's a fun experience to have, but also where like diversity is a byproduct of the values and the vision and the intentions of the organizations. So one of these examples is recognizing that for children of color, in particular Black boys, in schools, that Black boys in kindergarten or preschool are treated by their teachers or looked at the same way that Black boys in high school are. But that if Black parents have an opportunity to create relationship with their teachers, that the possibilities for those Black boys actually goes up tremendously. So we proactively then created 5 days in our policy that's just for parents or caregivers of children who are at school age. And so that's separate from vacation, separate from everything else. And you don't have to wait for your child to go to the principal's office. You could show up and be a part of your child's experience in schools to help. So how do we actually enable the organization to support people? The other one is we decided to not recognize any federal holidays as an organization because we're a multiracial organization. Instead, we rounded off to 12 holidays, and we converted them into what we call wellness days. And we took our 12 sick days and also converted them into wellness days. So we have 24 wellness days separate from vacation, where we don't have to wait for you to get sick, where you can take care of yourself, you could celebrate, honor, whatever, or not, or just take a nap. These are your days, and nobody's gonna take them away from you. And again, that's separate from vacation. So that we're really honoring people's agency as well. So how do we actually then embody the policy that we're pursuing?
Yeah, thank you for that. Would either Dr. Maybank or Chitra have a different response to distinguishing performative gestures, or at least how one can distinguish between a performative gesture and a genuine effort to advance racial equity in your organization?
Sure, I can respond. One way that I would think about it, or I do think about it, is how the level of commitment at every level of the organization that we see, and how much time is being allocated to considering the complexity around how to do this work, both the process and the outcomes. I think there's a definitely in my thought process around where did I want to be when I left DPA. The intentionality around the work we're doing here at UCS was really important to me. And I see that here where the organization at every turn is saying, here's what commitment looks like. It's in our vision, it's in our mission statement, it's in, or it's going to be in a revised statement, not up there yet. But and then all the way down to, is it in our performance evaluations? How does it show up in the way that each person does their work? And that through the, and even in the hiring process or in all of our job descriptions, the words equity and justice show up. So it is at that level where you can see that if somebody understands what those terms mean, they're going to be attracted to working here. If they don't even know how to grapple with that, then maybe this isn't going to be a great fit. And so in so doing, this is a long-term culture shift that we're going to see in this organization that was historically white-led organization, has all of the trappings of a movement that started with that history, but with new leadership and lots of work, investment at JEDI, I have some optimism that it's going to really shift. And I would say similarly, I think the level of hiring that's happening within federal government now, given how committed the administration has been to advancing justice and equity, including by revising the initial equity executive order to asking agencies through a new executive order to do even more and hold themselves accountable with annual updates and have lots of discussions across agencies. So those are the kinds of things where I think you can see that it's an ongoing commitment, not a one-time performative. This is a statement that shows virtue signaling.
Thank you. Thank you. So we really must get into this Q&A because we're getting a lot of questions. So we have a first question here from Jordan Bass. How have your respective agencies engaged in communities to co-create roadmaps that meet the need of the community that they impact? And maybe we can direct this question to Lorenzo.
Sure. So I'll give one example. Is we partner with okay, focus on one example. So we have supported an organization here in the Bay Area called Segurate, and they have an Indigenous land honor tax. And so we have, through a series of webinars and workshops and working with partner foundations to get them to invest and pay an Indigenous land tax and supporting their work. And so as some organizations, some foundations were on spending down, then move some significant resources towards that work, towards land repatriation is one example. We're about to expand that to look at other areas in California and hopefully later across the country to partner with Indigenous communities around how can we support in this effort to move wealth and power back into communities from which it was extracted, or in this case, stolen.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Maybank, would you have a different answer to that question?
I have the answer for the how AMA and how we're working to do it. Our audience, definitely physicians, and I think the way of which we are working towards there are a couple ways. One way is ensuring that we are hearing and partnering with our physicians who have been most historically marginalized and colonized. So NMA, the National Medical Association, that was created because Black physicians were excluded from the AMA, but also, with the Association of American Indian Physicians and the National Hispanic Medical Association. And so we host meetings, we have meetings, we convene, we hear feedback, we partner with those groups and center those groups within the physician community. Quite intentionally providing funding, but also hearing feedback and ideas for where we need to go in terms of our strategy to ensure that we're not just supporting, physicians are predominantly white still clearly in this country. And, making sure we're not only, focusing on the needs of white physicians, but all physicians, and also across gender identity as well as and sexual orientation as well. And we partner with the physician groups that represent them. The one thing that I will say, though, I think important to, and this was from before, because I know people don't always explicitly talk about this in terms of the investment and what between performative gestures and genuine efforts, financial investment, money. These organizations value money. And so if they aren't putting budget, and this is what we notice, especially with DEI officers or chief health equity officers, they're given these positions, they're given these titles, but often are not given the funding, not given the resources to even hire people to even put forward a team. And we have a team of 50, which is like one of the largest center for health equities in the country by far. And so holding accountability beyond performance is really critical. I think if it's not there, it's not present in an institution, if it doesn't show up in the dollars. To me, anything beyond, if the dollars aren't there to meet the need for doing this work across an entire institution, it's performative from my perspective.
Thank you for that clear articulation of the distinguishing between the two. Now I'd like to move to Chitra. You brought something up earlier about the workplace culture, and we want to know from the audience how one thinks about building workplace culture that fosters psychological safety, and how have you seen that either at your new organization or previous ones?
Yeah, this is a great question. I will give you an example from my time with EPA, sort of in the environmental justice space, where I was leading a team. When I started in that group, previously I had been in other parts of EPA where there was a low tolerance for mistakes or failure. The idea, if you didn't get it right, then there was a shame and blame aspect that was very internalized for me. And when I moved into this environmental justice space, the culture of the organization was, this is really hard work. Change work is like anything where you're advocating or you're trying to create, you're trying to do change work. You will not always succeed. And so you need to keep at it. You need to keep trying. And the idea of failure was something that we just didn't absorb very much. So that was one way I would say we had more psychological safety for people, because we allowed them to mess up sometimes and said, that's okay. Okay, how else can we get at the problem? Like, instead of going straight at something, you had to go around something. And so I think in that was one. And then one other strategy was—
May I just interject here, because we got a follow-up question for you here from the audience.
Okay.
And how would that may or may not affect your staffing up point that you made earlier in terms of opportunities or best practices for maintaining that safety, but also staffing up?
Yeah, this is really tough. I would say that the staffing up issue was a big one that EPA is still going through, which is they got flooded with resources over the past couple of years. And just give you a sense, like over the previous decade, they had so little grant money, like $2 million a year. And they went to having, all of a sudden, Inflation Reduction Act funding came by and they had $3 billion that they need to spend in a short amount of time. And needing to staff up to actually spend the money they were given and given the authority to grow. And it was not possible to do that in a way where people could build culture or organically, the way you would normally see an organization grows in small chunks to sort of maintain a culture. So that's an ongoing thing for them, a challenge. I think it is going to be something that they have to work through. And it's different here in UCS.
Yes, and especially as we think about what Dr. Maybank said regarding the funding, how sometimes you can get the funding and you see these new challenges of staffing up in a way that is safe and advancing the initiative. Okay, well, thank you all. As we wrap up, again, I just want to extend gratitude to our panelists for sharing their wisdom, their experience, and their commitment to this cause. We really are appreciative to our audience and taking away key themes from this talk, really around centering truth, how that is both historical and presently important for advancing transformation, sustaining that transformation through immediate actions and policies that have long-term impact, and ultimately a genuine approach to accountability in a world that is increasingly more visible, especially in anti-racism and other forms of racial equity work. We really want to make sure that we're pursuing measures that lead to real palpable change in the pursuit of racial equity. So thank you again from Ira to you, and thank you to the audience for tuning in today.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you now. Perfect.
Okay, good.
They're just wrapping up that last session, and then the IRA team is going to come on in here. Hi, Veronica.
Hi,
Hi. Thanks for hopping on a little early.
of course.
I was just saying they're wrapping up the first panel of the day, like right now, and then everybody else will come on in here. It's Carrie.
Can you hear me?